Oh, Afghanistan's former president Ashraf Ghani has released a statement explaining why he left Kabul in mid-August. Ghani says it was the only way to ensure peace in the capital. But he denies reports claiming that he fled Kabul with millions of dollars. Ghani says he is open to an official audit or even a financial investigation monitored by the UN. The former president, who served between 2014 and 2021, says he regrets his term ended without stability and prosperity. Ghani has apologized to all Afghans for his failure. He's been granted political asylum in the United Arab Emirates. With the Taliban in control, the US has frozen billions of dollars in bank reserves that could be used for aid. Other major donors, like the World Bank and the IMF, have also halted aid. They've said they're waiting to see what kind of leadership the Taliban demonstrates before releasing funds. Over the last 20 years, Afghanistan has relied heavily on foreign aid. The biggest donor, the US, poured about $36 billion into the economy for education and infrastructure projects. Humanitarian aid accounted for another $4 billion. But international support began to decline well before the Taliban took over. In 2009, it accounted for 100% of the country's GDP, but a decade later, it was less than half that. Afghanistan's domestically driven economy is fragile. Growth in the private sector has been limited, and about 40% of its workforce lives off of farming and agriculture. Lufti Rahimi is head of research at Bruni Institute and assistant professor of economics at American University of Afghanistan, and joins us via Skype now from London. Thanks very much for being with us. So we've just given kind of a breakdown there in that graphic of the distribution of aid and the fact that the US donates a large portion of it. But if we could expand on that a little bit, and I want to ask you, how has the total amount of aid and the makeup of that, where it goes, how has that changed over the years, over the last 20 years?
Well, thank you, Hazim, for having me. Aid has definitely changed. You could say 2012 was an inflection point in terms of how aid was being dispersed and given to Afghanistan. Usually there is a rolling 40-year routine aid conference that used to happen between the previous Afghan government and its international partners, where pledges used to happen. And on average, about $4 billion of development aid was being given to Afghanistan up until 2016. And 2012 marks an inflection point because there was a separation between military aid and development aid, and then also started the transition of security forces that declined aid to Afghanistan as well at that point. So you could say from a very macro perspective that up until 2016 there is about $6 billion of aid given to the government from 2001, and then the military aid was separated. That was about $5 to $6 billion as well. Since 2016, that has declined to $3 to $4 billion on each of these categories. And domestic revenue has been very low and not sufficient to actually finance the expenditures of a government of that size. So it had different periods and different factors involved in terms of its decline as well. Basic government expenditures were being funded through aid, something around, so 100% of development budget of the government was being funded through aid up until very recently, like 2019. Or 20, then the recurrent budget of the government, that's salaries mostly, and other bills that the government usually pays, was also being funded. Between 40 to 50% of it was being funded up until very recent days of that government through aid. So it has been an integral part of government, the previous government up until now.
All right. If I could ask you as well, we mentioned there at the top how the World Bank and the IMF are holding aid for now, and the United States as well, because they want to see what this Taliban government is going to look like. But we've seen the effects of that, how it's affecting Afghans, particularly in hospitals. Is that the right thing to be doing, to be, some would say, weaponizing aid like this?
Let me backtrack. That's not, I think, absolutely, that is not a very correct picture of putting it. The economy was declining way before the Taliban took over. Several years of conflict, siege to different cities had its impact. It displaced a lot of Afghans, disrupted flow of business and business as usual in all of these provinces. If you guys remember, a couple of months ago, Takhar province was under siege, Kunduz province, all the front lines. When the conflict was at its peak for the past 6 months, that has impacted life in Afghanistan beyond repair. So halting aid just because of the takeover that happened on the 14th of August hasn't caused these issues. And I think humanitarian aid is needed and it should be resumed. The US and these international development agencies like the IMF and the World Bank has their own concerns and legal issues in terms of holding back. But I think the World Bank is currently working with the current government of the Taliban on some health projects. Even on the 25th of August, there was a license issued by the US Treasury allowing humanitarian aid to flow into Afghanistan.
We've got to leave it there. Appreciate you talking to us, Lufti Rahimi in Kabul. Thanks. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you.